Okay, so we're on lesson 4 of topic 2, and it's called Building Nations. All right, so we're talking about what happened but for America and Canada and how they became the nations they are today. So the US and Canada both began as British colonies in North America, and they both became independent, but the way they became independent was different for both. So you all know this, for the US in 1776, the colonies demanded their independence from Britain and were willing to fight to get that independence. So the American Revolution really started in 1774, where the British colonies met together and had the first Continental Congress. And they were organized to oppose trade and tax laws that Britain had passed after the French and Indian War. Then later in 1776, they issued the Declaration of Independence, and they raised the army and fought the Revolutionary War against Britain. France actually joined in the fight and helped the U.S. win their independence. And that battle that actually decided this was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. So they set up a government and they wrote a constitution, and we all know the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the meaning behind all that. So the government was formed under a constitution, and it's called a republic, actually, and it just means that it's a government in which citizens elect representatives and leaders to make and enforce the laws. So it's important to know that when they formed the Constitution, they considered the United States a republic, okay? Over time, though, there was still more conflict with Britain. So the United States tried to remain neutral during the many European wars that happened throughout the 1800s. And there was wars that pitted France against Britain and then also other European powers. And so France was at war and they needed money to fund the war, so they actually sold Louisiana Territory to the U.S. in 1803. And this territory doubled the size of the United States. And then later, Britain and the United States fought the War of 1812. All right, let's see, what else? So over time, Americans wanted to move westward. Things got crowded on the East Coast. Resources started to be, a little more scarce. So they started to move westward. And as they did that, they forced the American Indian nations, who already lived over there, off most of their land. And so in exchange, they forced them to go live in these plots of land called reservations. And the reservations weren't places that were very hospitable to growing good crops, so it was not a great place for them. Then you have the Texas and the Mexican-American War. So some Americans settled more like into the areas where Texas is now, so Mexican-controlled Texas. And then those settlers started to rebel against Mexico and wanted to be a part of the U.S. So they established the Independent Republic of Texas in 1836. And then in 1845, the United States annexed Texas, or they took control back of Texas. And then because of all those things, the US and Mexico soon had a big war, and that was that Texas and Mexican-American War, and the US won. And so they got that part of Texas, and they also got territory, including Canada and most of the Southwest. So you have the War of 1812, right? Then you have the Texas and Mexican-American War. Then you have the Civil War, so just a chronological timeline. So as the territories of the states began to grow and become states, conflicts started to grow between the North and the South. So the South's plantations relied heavily on the labor of slaves, and so it was a big part of the traditions and just the workers' population. So the Southerners wanted the new states in the West to allow slavery, whereas the people in the North, for the most part, opposed the spread of slavery. Some of them objected to the cruelty of the slaves and the way these people were treated. Also, of course, the African Americans were also working to end slavery. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and his pledge was to stop the spread of slavery. Not to stop it altogether, but to stop the spread. And then in 1861, several southern states declared their independence and formed their government called the Confederacy. So the Civil War broke out between the Confederacy and the Union. The Union was the northern United States, the ones who were opposing slavery. And the war ended with the Union, or the North, winning. So after that, the nation started to rebuild, and then slavery was abolished. But African Americans still continue to face injustices. Just because they stopped slavery as a law, some people had that perception and that mindset that slavery was okay and that they weren't really people and that they were not equal to them. Then later, the Industrial Revolution comes along, right? So you have machines, machine power replacing human power. So as you have machines making things, things get made faster. You have, cities are growing because you have things being built at higher speeds. All right, so Canada, how did this come about? So after the U.S. won their independence from Britain, some Americans actually left and they went north and went to Canada because they were loyalists. So they were Americans that remained loyal to Britain even after the war was over. And so they moved to the colonies that would eventually become Canada. And so during the War of 1812, the U.S. invaded British territory in Canada. And because of that, the conflict united the Canadians with those loyalists against that common enemy, which was the U.S. Okay, so then by the mid-1800s, Britain was worried that America was going to keep going west and kind of take over Canada's territory, and they wanted the colonists of Canada to take on some of their government roles and get taxes from all those things. So to create a stronger government for the colonies, Britain passed the 1867 British North America Act. And it was the Constitution that created a new confederation or a new government called the Dominion of Canada. So that was the government that was set up in the beginning of the mid-1800s in Canada. So a dominion is just a territory that governs itself, but it's still tied to the colonizing country. So it's like Canada would govern themselves, but still have some kind of connection back to Britain, all right? So they remain under British rule. So while they still belong to Britain, Canada was pretty much united as a whole, right? Britain still controlled Canada's foreign affairs, but the country governed itself within the domestic affairs. Let's see what else. So one of the back to the U.S. The U.S. Was looking to expand its territories and get territories outside of the U.S. because they were looking for natural resources. So whenever you hear about the United States venturing out and getting other territories, it's usually about power, money, and natural resources. All right, let's see what else. All right, so then you have the Great Depression and World War II. So the Great Depression was a financial collapse in the U.S. in 1929, but it also happened around the world. And it led to the most severe economic decline in U.S. history. Later, you have World War II, where you have the U.S., Canada, and quite a few European and Asian allies defeat Germany and Japan. So these are just some big high points of things that happened in the U.S. And then after World War II, the United States came out as a superpower that was stronger nation than any of other nations. And so this helped the economy, it helped most people, but not all people did benefit from this. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, they still suffered a lot of racial discrimination. They're still in poverty. They didn't have full access or full benefit of this prosperity after these wars. And so the Civil Rights Movement was an effort of the African Americans to win equal rights. And this began like in the 1950s and continued through the 1960s and then even today, right? All right, one more thing about Canada. So during the 1900s, Canada emerged as a fully independent country and became a strong economic leader on the world stage, just meaning that they became powerful, financially sound, and better off than a lot of countries. So when Britain entered World War I in 1914, Canada joined as well. So that just kind of started their growth. And then in 1931, Britain granted Canada legal independence, but the British monarch remained Canada's symbolic head of state, like we talked about in class. All right, that's it.